Hello, my lovelies, and welcome back to Strange Playgrounds. Now, those of you who are fans of horror cinema may have noticed there's been a piece of work making a few waves recently. There's been a lot of talk about it on Twitter and online and on YouTube and whatnot. A piece of very small, ostensibly quite small market work, a semi-independent piece of work called Host, which is available on Shudder at the moment. It's causing a lot of stir. A lot of people have really enjoyed it. A lot of people have said that it's the horror film of this year, so obviously I had to go and check it out. I watched it yesterday. It was an interesting one yesterday, actually, because I watched several found footage horror films. Those of you who watch my channel consistently will know that I'm a bit of a mark for found footage and documentary horror films. Not a mark in the sense that I believe they're real, they're obviously not. In the sense that I really enjoy the format. I really enjoy the format. I think when it's done well, it is one of the most effective formats for just pure dread and atmosphere. The Blair Witch Project, which is one of the films I watched yesterday, is one of my favourite horror films of all time. I think it's absolutely beautiful. I love its elegance. I love the fact that it's so pared down, it's so inventive, it's so creative, it's raw atmosphere. It's pure atmospheric storytelling. It's all about the feeling of those frames and those shots, and it works so exquisitely well for me. It's one of my favourite films of all time. Bad found footage horror, for the most part, bad found footage horror is it's usually when it's when the works in question call attention to their own artifice. So they do something that's too filmic, it's too over-scripted, it's too narrative. They do some of the worst ones. They do even weird, bizarre things like add in filmic elements, like clear Foley sound effects or ambient music, even some of them do, and it's like, well, why would you do that in a found footage horror film? That doesn't make any sense. I watched another one called Tunnel yesterday, which was terrible, absolutely terrible, really derivative, by the numbers, and did exactly that, but only did it in the last act. In the last act it introduced ambient music, and you're like, well, that's just destroyed the entire thing. It's destroyed the entire artifice of the film. Why would you add in ambient music to a found footage horror film or a documentary horror film? It makes no sense. The third film that I watched was Host, and I was really anticipating this because a lot of people a lot of people who are quite prominent in independent horror and whatnot have said this is a great film. It's really scary. It's really frightening. I must admit I was underwhelmed. I was profoundly underwhelmed by it. It's not. I hazard to say it is not that it is a badly made film, but in any way, it's actually very effective in terms of what it sets out to do. It has a very clear, very pure, I suppose you could say, a very pure intention, in the sense that it's got no wider resonance or significance or commentary. It is just a pure horror film. It is trying to induce a sense of dread, a sense of panic, a sense of anxiety, and it's quite good at that. Quite good, not amazing. It never, at no point did this film leave me with the same sense of cold dread, the same shuddering quality that the Blair Witch Project does, or that other found footage horror films do. Particularly a lot of independent ones, a lot of those that have been released on YouTube recently. Things like No Through Road, for example. Things like Everyman Hybrid, things like Marble Hornets, things like Tribe 12, and so on and so forth. I think I found all of those vastly superior to this work, which is getting a lot of plaudits. Now, it's an interesting film in that it's probably one of the first horror films that acknowledges the current situation. What it is, essentially, it's a bog standard seance horror film, but which is it occurs within the COVID-19 era. It occurs within the lockdown. That's essentially what it is. So the format of it is of a Zoom conference call. And that's kind of cool. There's a lot you can do with that. There's a lot you can do with that that's really inventive. And there are a couple of things that are done certainly in the early chapters that are actually quite clever. I actually rather enjoyed when it was being subtle, when you were just seeing little glimpses, when you had to pay attention to what was going on all the cams. That was fun. That was interesting. Unfortunately for me, it doesn't go far enough. There's so much you could do with this technology and with this format that it just didn't do. For my money, there should have been a lot more subtle stuff like occurring in the background behind people that you would only see if you were looking directly at their cam, so that it gave the thing a little bit of replay value. But there isn't much of that, unfortunately. It doesn't play with the format enough. I was thinking what it was going to do was do something fun with like the time-lapse element of it. You know, the way there's distorted time and filtered reality when you're engaging with someone via a conference call or in a digital format, in the same way that Stephen Volk's Ghostwatch does, which is the project from 1992, which is very similar in terms of subject, in terms of theme, and in terms of atmosphere. Very, very similar. But it's vastly superior, actually. Vastly superior. There's a point in Stephen Volk's Ghostwatch where it's separated between a television studio and a purportedly haunted house. And the people in the studio are watching this footage of the house, and apparently nothing's happening. But then they realize that they're actually watching time-lapsed footage, like a recording of what happened earlier, and they have no idea of what's actually happening in the house. And that's really scary. That's really scary. This doesn't really do anything like that, and that's a real shame. There's a few moments where it uses the technology and uses it well, and I thought that was great, really well done, but it doesn't do it enough. It just doesn't do enough with the technology, and it doesn't do enough with the situation. I mean, there's a whole commentary here about isolation, about the sort of psychological effects of the COVID-19 era, of isolation and lockdown, of our reliance on technology and how we rely on it to maintain our relationships and whatnot. But it just isn't here. The film doesn't really go there. It doesn't want to go there. It's just very down the line. It's very, very, very pure, I suppose. It wants to be a horror film and nothing else. And I question it in that regard. I question the use of the format. I question the setting of it in the COVID-19 era. If you're not going to use it to comment upon it, which it doesn't, it's kind of dull in that regard. I wanted more from it. I was expecting it to do something phenomenally clever, to reveal something or to introduce some element which was a bit of a shocker, you know, which was really surprising and which maybe turned the whole thing on its head a little bit, or to introduce a little bit of ambiguity as to what is happening. Because, of course, you've got that element as well. There's a whole potential commentary on filtered reality here, which kind of almost occurs but doesn't go far enough. Essentially, what you expect no twists or turns here. What you think is happening is happening. What you assume is happening, that's it. That's the entire story. And there's a point where it just degenerates into waiting for these characters to die. That's what it is. That's all it is. It's just waiting to see what happens to them. But you know what's going to happen to them. And it just becomes jump scares. It just becomes jump scares. You're just waiting for the next jump scare to happen. And yeah, it's effective. The jump scares are well timed. The atmosphere is pretty good. It takes time to build its atmosphere, and the purity of it kind of works. It's not a badly made film at all. It's actually really well made. It's just, it doesn't go far enough for me. It doesn't do what I wanted it to do, you know? And I think that's because I made the mistake of watching the vastly superior Blair Witch Project earlier on, the older but vastly superior Blair Witch Project, which is, as I say, one of my favourite horror films. It kind of kick-started this whole concept. It wasn't the first documentary horror by any stretch, or the first found footage horror by any stretch, but it was the one that really kick-started it and brought into the focus the use of format to evoke a sense of dread and horror, which has been used time and time again since then. Shudder itself actually has a lot of stuff up that's vastly superior to this. There's a film on there, a Japanese film called Norori, which I've spoken about before on this channel, which is a more of a documentary horror than a found footage horror, although it mingles both, and that is vastly superior. Again, that actually does what this does. It uses the format of video footage and of found footage, and of the internet, in fact, to evoke a sense of dislocation and a sense of uncertainty, but it uses that format far more effectively. It blends it into its own mythology far more effectively than this does. It has moments that are good. The acting is superb all the way through. The acting is really good, really naturalistic. It does this thing where it shows you too much. I don't like it in found footage or documentary horror films where you see too much. I find what that tends to do is it emphasizes the artifice of them. It makes them too cinematic, it makes them too filmic, and breaks the verisimilitude. For me, a found footage horror film needs to have that element of uncertainty. Not that you believe it or whatnot, but that it has credibility. That's part of why I don't like the Paranormal Activity films. I really don't like them. When the first Paranormal Activity film hit and you were getting all this blurb about, oh, it's so scary, I went to see it at the cinema and I was powerfully underwhelmed. The reason I was underwhelmed is, unlike the Blair Witch Project, which uses all of these very clever directorial techniques whereby there was no script. There's no script for the Blair Witch Project. The actors are acting very naturalistically. They just had very bare bones direction from the director. So most of the key elements from the Blair Witch Project are actually naturalistic. They're things that the actors came up with themselves, and they were out in the woods. They were cold. They were hungry. So that was adding into the anxiety and the tension. It creates this incredible sense of realism, which works very well for found footage or documentary horror. Paranormal Activity does this thing where it's entirely scripted. Despite its attempt to evoke a sense of realism, it's entirely scripted, and you can see that it's entirely scripted. The lines are a little bit too actorly. The direction of the narrative is a little bit too rhythmic. It feels too much like a traditional horror story of this sense, and this is the same. This is the same. If you pull away the format, if you look beyond the format, what you've got here is the most bare bones, pared down seance haunted house horror story you could imagine. You could ever imagine. The most pared down story imaginable, to the point whereby, were it not for the format, you could have put this on YouTube on like a 10-minute video and it would have been fine. It would have been fine. There isn't enough material here. What I was expecting it to do, which a lot of found footage and documentary horror does, is maybe reveal something about the characters, reveal some background or some dynamic or relationship between the characters. It's not that the characters are bad, they're not. They're actually all kind of fun, they're kind of interesting. I particularly like Teddy. I thought he was loads of fun. He wasn't in it very much, but I liked him. He was a nice guy. And but there's not enough. There's not enough of the background, there's not enough of the dynamics between these guys. Also, what happened to Salen, the medium? I would have liked to have seen what happened to her. I thought it was going to maybe introduce some ambiguity whereby you didn't know whether what was happening was contrived somehow, something like that, or whether it was set up by somebody as a means of scaring the others. It just doesn't have any of that. It is really down the line. It's very straight. And that's fine. That's fine if that's what you want. I imagine if that's what you want, if you want just a straight horror film that has nothing else to it, no ambiguity, no bells and whistles, this will probably do it for you. It's actually quite good in that regard. But it doesn't do it for me. I was left largely underwhelmed by the end of it, and I would, for my money, I would go and watch something like No Through Road. I would go and watch Marble Hornets. I would go and watch Everyman Hybrid. I would go and watch The Blair Witch Project any day of the week. I would go and watch something like The Last Broadcast, which is another quite famous found footage documentary horror, which again uses the format. It uses the internet in its early days. It uses found footage documentary horror. The very concept of a documentary of terrible events, it uses, and it uses that as part of the mythology of the film. It's actually quite clever in that regard. This one, Host, I feel like I'm really damning it, and I don't mean to do that because it's not a bad film, and I'm glad I watched it. It's just I don't really get why it's getting the plaudits that it's getting. Were it not for the fact that it casually addresses the COVID-19 thing, the lockdown, were it not for the format, then it wouldn't be anything. Nobody would be commenting on it. It wouldn't really be that significant. Also, that last jump scare is kind of fuck off for me. I really, really hate horror films that end on cheesy jump scares. I do not like them. I like what happens at the end of The Blair Witch, where it's not a jump scare, it's just weird. It's cold and it's unexplained and it's strange. I love that. I love that to bits. I don't like cheesy jump scares. I particularly, and this is a massive spoiler by the way, so if you don't want it spoiled, stop listening now. I really hate the fact that you see the demon. I really hate that. I didn't want to see it. I didn't want to see it. I didn't want to see a cheesy, screaming demon on screen. That kills it for me. It kills it stone dead. There are certain types of film where you can get away with that. There are certain types of film. Found footage isn't one of them. It just doesn't work. It's, I mean, one of the worst I've ever seen is another one that people love called Grave Encounters. Grave Encounters. And that developed a kind of pseudo mythology because it was never released in the UK, and one of the mythologies that built up around it is, oh, it's so scary, that's why they're not releasing it. Watch it and it's terrible. I mean, it's flat out terrible. It's cheesy kind of YouTube level CG effects that most people could do better on their home laptops these days. It's the screamer face nonsense. It's just terrible. I hated it. I hated Grave Encounters so much. It's the anti found footage horror. This one isn't that. It's nowhere near as bad as that. But they just couldn't resist doing the cheesy jump scare at the end, and I was like, oh, come on. Come on. And that's what it degenerates into, unfortunately. It just degenerates into waiting for the jump scare. And that's a real shame, because I think there's promise here. What I'm hoping is we see more of these. I'm hoping we see more of the Skype chat horror. I'm hoping we see more of the video conference call horror, because I think it has legs. I think it's there's so much potential. There is so much potential in this, but this one doesn't hit it for me. It doesn't do enough. There's a few moments that are really subtle and really clever, like when they're carrying their cameras around and you see like just something off screen and you're like, oh, did I see that? That's brilliant. That is brilliant. I love it. But there's not enough. There's just not enough of it. When you're seeing something and they're not, that's scary. That's really scary. But there's just not enough of it here. I wanted more from it. I was not that impressed, I've got to say. I was a little bit underwhelmed. And that may have been just because of context. That may have just been because of the hype surrounding it, and it may have been because I spent the day watching found footage horror films. It could have been because of that. But yeah, Host, an interesting experiment, not really one that does it for me, I've got to say.